the first thing would be to ask yourself whether, based on your own experience and your time of training, you think your aerobic engine is as big as it can be. So, looking to increase your VO2 max would be an obvious way to do that. And with actually one of your colleagues at St
Mm,
Mary's, Sarah Coakley, Sarah and I did a study together where we gave people both. Sorry, we had different groups of people training for us, and some did high intensity interval training. So they essentially were making maximal efforts of 2 or 3 minutes repeatedly. Or we had another group that did moderate intensity, or kind of moderate intensity in the from for the physiologists out there in the heavy domain training, where they exercised, but
mm,
essentially for 40 to 50 minutes. So that by the end of that 40 to 50 minutes, they'd done pretty much as they could, but the intensity of these efforts was really quite different. So some were exercising 40 for 50 minutes in a more or less continuous, sustained manner, and some were doing these short, really high intensity intervals. So what's popularized as HIIT, high intensity interval training. And what
mm.
Sarah and I found was that the gains in fitness were very similar for both protocols. Now, there's
Okay.
the subtlety of that from the literature perspective is that if you just evaluate the benefit in terms of the amount of time you spent training, then the high intensity interval training was much more effective per minute of training time. So you got the same gains, but from a much shorter training session. But not everybody necessarily enjoys doing that. Or you might want to do a mix of different training approaches, in which case you know that two very different looking sessions can actually achieve similar or comparable kinds of gains. So, coming back to your question about the 20-minute thing,
Mm,
you could think about it as like if you want to improve your performance at 20 minutes, a really obvious thing to do is to exercise for 20 minutes as hard as you can, and hope that you can gradually push it forwards just by repeating your 20-minute efforts. The high intensity interval approach would be to go above that and do these repeated high intensity intervals. Now, the benefit of that approach is that you'd be working at a power output that's much greater than you can manage for 20 minutes. But you could actually, over time, accumulate 20 minutes in one session by, let's say, doing 4 minute blocks at a power output that's much higher than your 20-minute block, and then resting for a little bit and then doing
mm.
another 4 minute block. So now you've done 8, and then rest a bit and then do another 4 minute block, and now you've done 12, and so on. And then eventually you get to 20 minutes, but you've accumulated it at a much higher power output. Equally, you could think about pushing your fitness up from underneath by exercising at below your 20-minute intensity, but for a much longer period of time, like we said in Sarah's study, for 40 or 50 minutes or so. And the difference, it
Mm,
really is that in each of those sessions, you're trying to go close to the maximum that you can, but you're doing it for very different intensities and very different durations. So you can imagine if you're doing short, high intensity intervals, and I know I use 20 minutes as my example, but typically you might not even go much longer than that. So you're doing really high, short sessions. And then as you drop the intensity, they get progressively longer and longer, but in a way that we sometimes forget. It's not quite a linear progression, it's disproportionately. So if you drop the intensity a little bit, you have to go much longer to reach the same training adaptations.